Good morning. With my thoughts this morning, I'm going to take a slightly different direction than what I had originally intended. Because when I put the subject of today's lesson in the newsletter and Linda on the PowerPoint, I worded it differently, and as I got into it, it took a slightly different turn than what I had intended. So it's the same subject, basically, but I've broadened it somewhat. And consequently, I'm giving it a different name and really a different text also. So there's no confusion. It's just that things develop sometimes that way. Not always, but sometimes they do. So anyway, with that thought in mind, how was your week last week? How did it go? From last Sunday to this Sunday, how were things for you? Okay. Was it a little bit busy? It's the season for it, right? Was it somewhat hectic? It's okay to say yes. It's all right. Was it a little bit crazy? Suppose every week was that way, and suppose your week was that way times 100, and you knew at the end of it you would die. Not only that you would die, but that you would be executed. Suppose you knew that as your week started, and you try to go about your business with that knowledge of exactly how things are going to turn out, and you tell others about it, as in the reading which Kyle did earlier from Matthew 16, as Jesus did with his disciples. And he told them exactly how things would play out. And Peter argued with him about it and said it's not going to happen. Suppose that was the week that you had to deal with. How would you handle it? Well, that's the way it was with Jesus in the week that we're going to look at. Initially, I had planned to start on Friday and work through Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday, and then a little bit beyond that. But I'm going to back it up to Sunday, looking at the life of Christ, his last week on earth, what Jesus did day to day, leading up to Friday, the day of his crucifixion. And we focus so much attention, and rightly so, on Friday and what happened then. But I want us to go back a few days and in a quick review, think about what Jesus did during that week. Now, as I attempt to do so, I'm going to beg your indulgence because a sermon like this deals with chronology, the order of events, and you're going to have to be patient with me because Matthew, and I'll be working from Matthew this morning, but he does not always record things in chronological order, and we will be dealing with Jewish time as opposed to our time, Jewish time where a day began later in the evening and went, 24 hours. So there's going to be that slight difference. So you be easy on me. If you want to correct me on something along that line, you just hold off. Because I've made enough mistakes already this morning to realize that's not a good sign. All right? So you just hang in there, and we'll handle this the best we're able from day to day. How did Jesus live his last week on earth, beginning with Sunday, otherwise known as the first day of the week, in Scripture. To us, the Lord's Day, which for him began in the evening hours of what we would call Saturday. But this is the opening of Sunday for him, and he's invited to a meal. In Matthew chapter 26, he's at Simon's house. A woman walks in off the street and anoints him with oil and wipes it with her hair. And Jesus accepts it as a token of what's going to happen to him in just a matter of a few days. Nobody else understands it, but he does. That same day, Judas is working to betray the Lord, turn him over to authorities. He's making his plans. He's doing his dirty work. And all of that is going on Sunday. Judas is at work in verses 14 through 17. And then on that same day, later in the day, and we back up with this to Matthew 21. And again, Matthew didn't record these things necessarily chronologically, but backing up to Matthew 21, Jesus makes his triumphal entry, as we call it, into the city of Jerusalem in fulfillment of prophecy. That was a Sunday for him. Busy day. Monday. Busy day for you. Busy day for all of us. On Monday, Jesus did, as we call, cleanse the temple. In other words, he ran the money changers, those people who had forgotten what the temple was all about and the purpose of it. He ran them out of there. In Matthew 21, verses 12 through 16, and recalled the purpose of the temple. A little bit later, as he was passing through and out of the temple, he noticed a fig tree, being hungry. You're hungry in the morning sometimes, right? Need something to eat? Jesus spotted a fig tree. But guess what? This tree had leaves, but it had no fruit. There's a sermon on that. And he, as we call it, cursed the fig tree. In other words, pronounced it dead. It began to die immediately. The disciples knew it, noticed it, and Jesus taught regarding the fig tree, and that was his Monday. There were many other things going on too, I'm sure, but for our purposes, that was Monday for him. Then Tuesday. Tuesday is the day of questions, as we call it, because the authorities come around him wanting answers and begin to question him, number one, about his authority. Why did he do the things that he did, that is, in running the money changers out of the temple, and who gave him the right to do that anyway? So, Jewish authorities approaching him, throwing all kinds of questions at him in Matthew 21, 23 through 27. And he's dealing with and debating with those. And then Tuesday was a day of parables. He gave 3 parables in Matthew 21. And if you just scan down the chapter, you'll notice these parables each in their place. The first one, in verses 25 through 28, the parable of 2 sons. And then a little bit later, here comes another parable, and then in verses 28 through 32, the parable of 2 sons. Then another parable, the parable of the landowner, beginning at verse 33, and then the third parable in the 22nd chapter of a wedding feast, and many who were invited, and all the implications involved in that. Jesus did a lot of teaching the last week of his life, even on the cross, of all places. But on Tuesday, he's teaching, and a series of parables. And then a lot of controversy, a lot of questions continuing still, controversies, debates, all of that going on, wrangling with the religious authorities in verses 15 through the end of the chapter. In verse 46, a lot of contention. And then Jesus was preaching. A lot of preaching. And that preaching begins in Matthew chapter 23, a scathing sermon against the Pharisees, hypocrites, religious leaders as they were. He lowered the boom on them. In chapter 24, with his disciples, regarding the destruction of Jerusalem. Chapter 25, again, a series of parables. And then the nature of the kingdom regarding those who are in it and those who are not in it. The goats, the sheep. The sheep constitute the kingdom. The goats don't. And the difference between the two. He did a lot of preaching on that day. And some hard sermons. And preaching that still benefits us to this day. That was Tuesday. Wednesday is almost like a day off because we don't have much of any information with regard to what he might have done on Wednesday. Chapter 26 of Matthew opens with these words. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings that he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." All right, Wednesday, 2 days, then comes the Passover. That's about all we know as far as his Wednesday is concerned. We don't have anything more. But imagine, if you can, that Jesus goes to bed that night, Wednesday night, pillows his head for the last time on earth. Because after that, it's a marathon. He wakes up for the last time on earth, Thursday. On Thursday, his hour has come. The time is here. He's preparing to observe the Passover. He observes a meal with his disciples in preparation for the Passover. And in that meal, he gives new meaning to the elements of that meal. The unleavened bread, the fruit of the vine. He gives new meaning to it in Matthew 26, 17 through 30, which we still reflect on today as far as what it means to us in terms of the Lord's Supper. Because he's taught his disciples, he said, this bread, when you take this bread is my body. This cup is my blood, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. When you take it, remember me. That was a meal in preparation for the Passover. We understand it today in terms of what it means now. Jesus gave new meaning to all of that. And that was on Thursday that he did so. Then comes Friday. And Friday is nonstop until the cross. Friday finds him in Gethsemane with his disciples, asking Peter, James, and John, wait over here just a little while. I'm going over yonder to pray. I'll be back in just a little bit. He comes back, finds them asleep. He says, what is it? You couldn't wait 1 hour for me? Wait here. I'll be back in a little bit. He goes back to pray again. They're asleep again. Just like some of us would be. He goes a third time. They sleep again. All right, he says, come on, the time is now. We find him in Gethsemane, in prayer to the Father, pouring out his heart, asking the Father, is there any other way, if it's possible at all, that this cup should pass from me? Let it pass, but let your will be done. That's in Gethsemane. Then Judas, again, he's kicked it up a notch. He's gone to contact the authorities. They're on their way now to arrest Jesus on Thursday. The disciples, they've scattered. They're gone. In verse 57, he appears before Caiaphas. This is what we call the Jewish trial. And he answers questions with regard to Caiaphas. And then in verse 59 through 68, he stands before the chief priests, the elders, the priests, the council, otherwise known as the Sanhedrin. And This is the trial that would determine his fate. Peter, standing off a bit, kind of watching how things might unfold, but keeps himself secret. But then, after the appearance before the Sanhedrin, Peter comes around, and he's spotted by a woman who says, "I know who you are. I saw you." "Oh, no, not me, not me." And he denies the Lord as the cock crows. And a bell goes off in his head to realize, I did exactly what he said I would do. Then there's Pilate in chapter 27, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 11 through 15, as Jesus stands before Pilate. And then the decision with regard to Barabbas. Barabbas is brought out. We typically bring a prisoner out for exchange. Here's Barabbas. He's a no good. He's a felon. Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus? Which one do you want? Well, let Barabbas go. Keep Jesus. We'll kill him. So this is all going on Friday. Jesus is scourged that day. Scourging, we can't imagine what a scourging was like. We have no concept of just how brutal that was. When a man was scourged prior to crucifixion, they usually went into a state of shock. I don't know in Jesus' case what happened here. But we really have no idea of just how brutal that is or was. And Isaiah reminds us, by his stripes we are healed. By his scourging we are healed. And his blood. He's stripped of his clothes, a robe is put on him, a crown of thorns on his head, a scepter in his hand. King of Israel, save yourself. And then after a while, the robe is removed. His own clothes are put back on him. And he's led away to Golgotha, the place of the skull. And it's there that he's made to lay down on the ground and his arms stretched out and nailed to the crossbeam. And that crossbeam is hoisted up and lifted and put on the post that's in the ground. And his feet are brought up and nailed to that. And it's there that he lingers for 6 hours that Friday. And 2 thieves, 2 felons on each side. And you understand and you remember the conversation took place between the two. And you remember the words of Jesus from the cross, the things that Jesus said. He was teaching even from the cross. Series of sermons I've done on those, in times past. And after 6 hours, it is finished. He yields up his spirit to the Father. Jesus dies. He's taken down from the cross. Others are involved in preparations for what will happen next. And Jesus is taken to a tomb. It's a new tomb, never before been used, and he's laid there. And the stone is rolled over the opening, and the door is closed, and he's buried. And that ends his Friday. Now, that's a busy week. That's a hectic week. That's a week like you cannot dream of nor imagine. Now, think of what all transpired that week, and we're not done with it yet. Next week, Lord willing, I'll continue with it a little bit more because there's the Lord's Day that's coming. There's a resurrection that will follow. But at this point, Jesus is in the grave, and I have to remember, I can appreciate this because it's for me that he did that. It's because of sin that he was taken there. It's because of his love for me that he stayed there, although he could have called legions of angels to have delivered him. He didn't. He stayed, he died. And throughout the week made his way to the cross willingly to die for you, for me. And that message we preach, and when we sing, "Tell me the old story," that's it. And that's the story that has impact, because what Jesus did on that week what He did that week has meaning for you and for me, and it impacts not only your life here, but eternity, doesn't it? Because what do you do with that? How do you respond to it? Do you react with a heart of humility and love and obedience to the Lord who came and gave and sent His apostles out with the Great Commission to preach the gospel to all creatures? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. The message is plain and comes to you now. Think on it. React to it. Respond to it while we stand now and sing to encourage you.